The Middle East has just exploded into chaos once again. A so-called ceasefire agreement was single-handedly shredded by the United States and Israel barely 12 hours after it was signed. They might package it as a ceasefire, but let us be brutally honest. This was nothing more than a calculated halftime break orchestrated by Washington. It is a geopolitical farce that has the whole world watching, and it has pushed Iran to the absolute brink, prompting Tehran to immediately pivot and request China to step in as a guarantor of peace. So, what exactly is unraveling here? Let us cut through the geopolitical jargon and break this down. We are not just going to dissect the immediate theater. We are going to trace the deep-rooted origins and expose the underlying calculations of all the players involved. I want to show you why this ceasefire fiasco was no accident, but the inevitable culmination of long-standing U.S. hegemonic maneuvering and Middle Eastern geopolitical friction. We will also examine exactly why Iran has zeroed in on China and what pivotal role Beijing can actually play in this volatile landscape. This episode is packed with high-value intel, so buckle up. If you have not already, hit that like button and subscribe. To understand this charade, we need to look at the buildup. Even before this ceasefire was inked, the Middle East was already a powder keg ready to detonate. Months of tit-for-tat military confrontations had led to mounting casualties and devastating losses, until the U.S. itself began to feel the immense strategic strain and suddenly decided to pivot to a so-called truce. On the evening of April 7th, Eastern Time, just half an hour before his own self-imposed deadline, Donald Trump hastily took to social media to announce a 2-week ceasefire with Iran. He made sure to heavily emphasize a core precondition. Posing as the ultimate guardian of global peace, he grandstanded for the cameras, bragging about his tireless efforts for Middle Eastern stability. He painted a picture where he, and he alone, salvaged the region from the brink of total annihilation, even implying that without him, an all-out regional war would have already erupted. On the other side of the chessboard, Iran was already buckling under the relentless attrition of war. It is not that their military capabilities are weak. In fact, their missile stockpiles remain robust and heavily secured. Ali Larijani, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, recently dismantled the narrative that Iran's missile capabilities had been wiped out. He categorically stated that their arsenals are intact, fully stocked, and actively deployed, sharply questioning if our missile capabilities are destroyed. Where are the daily strikes hitting the U.S. and Israel coming from? However, the chronic conflict has severely impacted Iran's economy and civilian life. With energy infrastructure facing sporadic attacks, overseas assets frozen, and international sanctions providing zero relief, Tehran desperately needed a breathing space and a credible security guarantee. Consequently, when Trump announced the ceasefire, Iran leveraged the opportunity. They immediately declared that on April 10th, they would head to Islamabad, Pakistan, for 2 weeks of political negotiations with the U.S. Tehran was careful to frame this as an effort to consolidate their strategic victories, aiming to establish a new regional security and political architecture through diplomacy within a 15-day window. For a brief moment, the entire world breathed a sigh of relief. The UN, the EU, and multiple Middle Eastern states were quick to voice their support, urging both sides to capitalize on this diplomatic window to resolve their disputes. Even some Arab nations that traditionally lock horns with Iran privately expressed hope that the truce would hold after all. The fires of war in the Middle East have been burning for far too long. Any further escalation would only displace countless more innocent civilians and severely undermine global energy supplies and economic stability. Everyone thought the Middle East could finally enjoy a few days of quiet, that this protracted conflict was finally seeing a turning point. But reality delivered a brutal slap in the face. This ceasefire, upon which the entire world had pinned its hopes, was so fragile it could not even survive half a day, less than 12 hours after the ceasefire took effect. In fact, not even 8 hours in deafening explosions echoed across Iranian territory, shattering the brief calm. According to authoritative reports from Iran's Mehr news agency on April 8th, a series of massive explosions suddenly rocked the Lavan Island oil refinery in southern Iran. Plumes of thick smoke and raging flames engulfed the site, with black smoke visible from miles away. Simultaneously, several explosions were heard on Siri Island, a location of immense strategic importance. While perhaps less catastrophic than the blasts on Lavan Island, it was enough to signal to everyone that the ceasefire was dead on arrival. The National Iranian Oil Refining and Distribution Company swiftly issued a statement confirming that the Lavan Island refinery had been deliberately targeted by enemy forces. Fortunately, rapid response from firefighting units contained the blaze before it could claim any lives. The core energy supply network remained largely intact, though damaged facilities will require subsequent repairs. It is worth noting that while Tehran explicitly stated the refinery was attacked by enemies, they refrained from directly naming the US or Israel. But let us be real. Anyone analyzing the geopolitical board knows that, apart from Washington and Tel Aviv, no other actor possesses both the motive and the capability to execute a stealth strike on critical Iranian energy infrastructure at such a hypersensitive moment. The Lavan Island refinery is a linchpin of Iran's energy sector, refining massive quantities of crude oil essential for both domestic supply and economic stability. Siri Island, situated along the Persian Gulf coast, holds a pivotal strategic position. It is a vital node in Iran's defense architecture, commanding key shipping lanes and directly influencing transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Hitting both targets simultaneously, mere hours after a ceasefire, was a highly calculated move. The objective was unmistakable: to provoke Iran, sabotage the truce, and disrupt Tehran's strategic deployments. The only actors with the means and the motive to orchestrate this are the United States and its ally, Israel. You might be asking, did not the US just commit to a ceasefire? Did not they issue explicit, written orders prohibiting any bombings or military strikes? How could they flip the script so fast without even a shred of plausible deniability? Frankly, it is not surprising in the least. Anyone familiar with Washington's diplomatic playbook knows that institutional unreliability is baked into its DNA. From the end of World War II to the present day, the sheer number of international agreements breached and treaties shredded by the US is staggering. If a pact no longer serves their immediate interests, they will tear it up without a second thought, even if they were the ones who drafted it. In the face of raw hegemonic power, any treaty or diplomatic promise is worth less than scrap paper. Take this latest ceasefire, for instance. Washington never had the slightest intention of honoring it. This so-called truce was merely a tactical timeout, a stopgap measure designed to let them catch their breath and recalibrate. Why? Because leading up to this, the relentless military strikes launched by the US and Israel against Iran, while achieving some tactical gains, came at a steep cost. Iran's counteroffensives had ratcheted up the pressure on the US-Israeli axis. Iranian missile strikes had significantly damaged multiple Israeli military bases, and US troops stationed across the Middle East were under severe threat. Couple that with mounting international pressure, as numerous nations lined up to condemn Washington's hegemonic overreach and demand an end to hostilities, and even America's staunch allies were beginning to waver. They were increasingly reluctant to follow Washington blindly down a path of endless escalation, knowing full well that a protracted war would inevitably hemorrhage their own interests. Backed into this corner, the US was forced into a temporary stand-down. On one hand, it was a maneuver to alleviate international blowback and avoid total diplomatic isolation. On the other, it was a calculated play to buy time. Time to restructure military deployments, replenish arsenals, and tacitly greenlight Israeli stealth strikes to systematically degrade Iranian capabilities. It was about stacking the deck for future negotiations or laying the groundwork for the next wave of military assaults. Let us not mince words. America's ceasefire was never about peace. It was about reasserting dominance and achieving its Middle Eastern ambitions at the lowest possible cost. From the very beginning, this ceasefire was a masterclass in deception, a global farce designed to pull the wool over the eyes of the international community. In the aftermath of the bombings, Iran's reaction caught many off guard. They did not immediately launch a counteroffensive. Instead of the anticipated barrage of ballistic missiles raining down on U.S. or Israeli military bases, Tehran pivoted to seeking security guarantees. They wanted credible nations to step up and ensure Washington would not breach the agreement again. Now, a lot of observers looking at this might assume Iran blinked, that they were intimidated by the U.S.-Israeli stealth strikes and lost their nerve. But that is a massive misread. Iran is not scared of a fight. They are simply exhausted by American deception. They have been burned by Washington's broken promises, one too many times to ever trust them again. On April 8th, Iran's ambassador to China. He explicitly stated that the U.S. has reneged on its word 3 separate times and has a history of invading Iran. This is the core reason why Tehran no longer trusts Washington, and why their immediate reaction was not retaliation, but a desperate search for ironclad security guarantees. If we rewind the historical tape, it is glaringly obvious that the U.S. has never negotiated with Iran in good faith. The friction between these two nations has been compounding for decades, and American perfidy is the thread tying it all together. The quintessential example is the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Years ago, in a bid to alleviate international pressure and normalize its global standing, Iran proactively signed the accord with the P5+1, agreeing to curtail its nuclear program. In exchange, the U.S. and its allies promised to lift sanctions and reintegrate Iran into the global economy. But just a few years in, Washington unilaterally torpedoed the agreement, disregarding every stipulation. The U.S. reimposed crippling sanctions, froze Iranian overseas assets, and strangled their crude oil exports, dealing a devastating blow to the Iranian economy, and it did not stop there. Post-JCPOA. The U.S. engaged in a classic two-faced strategy, feigning interest in diplomacy while covertly tightening the noose, launching military strikes against Iranian infrastructure, and assassinating top Iranian generals. The deception extends far beyond the nuclear deal. Washington once promised economic aid if Iran dialed back certain military capabilities. Iran made the concessions, the U.S. reneged, doubling down on sanctions instead. On another occasion, the U.S. guaranteed the security of Iran's energy exports, only to turn around and collude with allies to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Time after time, these betrayals have completely bankrupted America's credibility in Tehran. As Iranian officials have bluntly put it, negotiating with the U.S. is like negotiating with thin air. You are likely to get sold out the moment you turn your back. Rather than trusting American promises, it is safer to trust your own deterrence. So, why did Iran even sit at the table for this latest ceasefire? From the outset, they harbored zero illusions. They never expected Washington to genuinely honor the truce. The strategy was simply to leverage the negotiations to secure a credible safety net, preventing an immediate relapse into war and buying their domestic economy a brief respite. It was also a litmus test to see if the international community could offer Iran a fair shake and push back against American hegemony. But this lightning-fast violation by the U.S.-Israeli axis vindicated Tehran's worst fears, shattering any lingering illusions. America's ceasefires are designed to deceive. At the press conference, Ambassador Fazli delivered a stark ultimatum. He made it crystal clear: if the U.S. continues to disregard agreements, betray trust, and launch strikes, Iran will retaliate with overwhelming force. making Washington bitterly regret its actions and pay a heavy price. That rhetoric is fierce, but beneath it lies Iran's deep frustration and a desperate craving for regional security. It is not that Iran does not want to strike back or lacks the capacity. They possess a formidable missile arsenal, a sophisticated defense grid, and the sheer audacity to confront hegemonic power. But they are acutely aware that unleashing a full-scale retaliation would only engulf the Middle East in a wider inferno, plunging more innocent civilians into suffering and backing themselves into a corner. Therefore, Iran chose strategic restraint. They chose to seek guarantors. This is not cowardice. It is calculated rationality. It is a profound desire for peace and a highly responsible approach to their own national survival. Having completely seen through the American facade, Iran has now pinned all its hopes on one global power, China. On that exact same day, April 8th, while addressing the press in Beijing, Ambassador Fazli formally submitted a monumental request. Iran wants China to step in as a guarantor of peace in the Middle East. He also called upon the UN Security Council, Russia, and regional actors willing to mediate, like Pakistan and Turkey, to form a united coalition. The objective? To collectively underwrite a guarantee that the U.S. will not reignite the war, to hold the line for Middle Eastern peace, and to drive long-term stability in the region. Honestly, this request from Tehran is not surprising in the least. In our current geopolitical climate, China stands alone as the only major power possessing the capability, the credibility, and the strategic responsibility to offer Iran an ironclad security guarantee. Beijing has undoubtedly emerged as the external power Tehran trusts the most. Now, you might be asking, with so many global heavyweights out there, why is Iran laser-focused on China? Why not seek out other nations as guarantors? The reasons are intensely pragmatic. It boils down to three core factors, each hitting the geopolitical nail on the head, reflecting China's mantle as a responsible major power and underscoring Iran's profound trust in Beijing. First, China has consistently maintained a stance of absolute neutrality and impartiality. Unlike Washington, China never leverages its sheer military or economic weight to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations or bully smaller states. Instead, it operates strictly on principles of non-interference and mutual benefit. On the global stage, China consistently aligns itself with peace, equity, and international law, tirelessly brokering dialogue. Whether it was the Iran nuclear issue in the past or the current U.S.-Israeli friction, China's mandate has always been to promote peace and facilitate talks, never showing favoritism. This unwavering impartiality is the absolute bedrock of Iran's trust in Beijing. Second, when this U.S.-Israeli conflict hit a complete deadlock, with tensions at a boiling point and the threat of an all-out regional war looming over everyone, it was China that proactively stepped into the breach. It was Beijing's aggressive diplomatic mediation that engineered the initial breakthrough for a ceasefire. Iran has clearly seen and internalized this diplomatic muscle and genuine commitment to peace. Even before this truce was signed, Beijing had already done the heavy lifting. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi conducted 21 phone calls with foreign ministers from over a dozen nations, relentlessly emphasizing the imperative of a ceasefire and urging maximum restraint. Immediately after the conflict erupted, China's special envoy for the Middle East launched shuttle diplomacy, visiting key players, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Egypt. He engaged in deep consultations with foreign ministers, the Arab League, and the GCC to forge a consensus for peace. On multilateral platforms like the UN, China firmly demanded an immediate cessation of hostilities, warning all parties against pushing the region past the point of no return, and repeatedly vetoed resolutions that blatantly favored the West at the expense of Middle Eastern peace. Make no mistake, without China's proactive orchestration, this ceasefire agreement would not have even materialized. Tehran knows perfectly well that only Beijing possesses the leverage to genuinely drive Middle Eastern peace and provide a reliable security net. Third, recently, the UN Security Council saw a Western-biased resolution targeting the Strait of Hormuz, a move clearly designed to corner Iran. It was a joint Sino-Russian veto that torpedoed that resolution, blocking Western powers from further undermining Tehran and safeguarding Iran's core interests. Iranian officials have stated time and again that China and Russia are their true friends and strategic partners in times of adversity. When facing suffocating U.S. sanctions and direct military threats, Beijing and Moscow have consistently backed Iran, pushing back against American hegemonic overreach and helping Tehran weather the storm. Beyond geopolitics, the Sino-Iranian economic synergy is ironclad. China is a premier market for Iranian crude and a crucial partner across sectors like energy and infrastructure. This deep-rooted economic foundation solidifies their mutual trust, convincing Tehran that Beijing will genuinely have its back as a reliable security guarantor, facing Iran's direct request. China's foreign ministry responded swiftly, without a trace of evasion or lip service, showcasing true major power responsibility. On April 8, spokesperson Mao Ning stated at a regular press conference that China continues to closely monitor the evolving situation in the Middle East and is deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis fueled by escalating regional tensions. She urged all parties to exercise restraint, resolve disputes through dialogue and negotiation, and prevent further deterioration. She affirmed that Beijing will maintain close communication with all stakeholders, continue to exert efforts to de-escalate tensions, quell the violence, and realize enduring peace, actively driving the construction of a new Middle Eastern security architecture. China's response stripped away the empty rhetoric. It was all about pragmatic action, by neither outright accepting nor rejecting Iran's plea. This calculated response simultaneously accounted for Iran's security imperatives, the broader stability of the Middle East, and the collective interests of the international community. This is what major power responsibility looks like: rejecting hegemony, refusing to pursue selfish gains, prioritizing peace above all, and using concrete actions to propel global stability. But if we peel back the layers of this ceasefire farce, two critical flashpoints remain. These are not just deciding factors for the U.S.-Iran negotiations. They are the absolute linchpins for regional stability, global energy security, and the broader economic order. I am talking about the high-stakes game of chicken in the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran's ultimate red line, its definitive 10-point plan. Let us dissect the Strait of Hormuz choke point first. Ambassador Fazli revealed that roughly 3,000 vessels are currently stranded in the strait. The shipping lanes are severely congested, with countless captains paralyzed by the fear of being targeted in the crossfire. While Tehran is attempting to alleviate this bottleneck, for instance, by allowing limited transit under strict Iranian supervision, the complete reopening of this vital artery hinges entirely on the outcome of the upcoming U.S.-Iranian negotiations. It is, without a doubt, one of the most potent leverage points in Iran's arsenal. To understand the gravity of this, we need to look at the numbers. The Strait of Hormuz is the sole maritime gateway out of the Persian Gulf. It is the absolute jugular of global energy trade, widely dubbed the world's oil valve. Every single day, approximately 20 million barrels of crude and refined petroleum transit through this choke point. That is 25% of global seaborne oil trade, and 20% of global liquid fuel consumption. Roughly 34% of the world's oil exports, 30% of LPG, and 20% of LNG rely on this narrow passage. More critically, over 90% of Saudi Arabia's crude exports and almost the entirety of Iraq's oil shipments depend on it. If Hormuz is blockaded, the global energy supply chain collapses. Oil prices will skyrocket, and the global economy will face a seismic shock. Since the U.S.-Israeli conflict escalated, the transit order in Hormuz has totally imploded. Daily vessel traffic plummeted from a baseline of 125 ships down to single digits. On March 14th, we witnessed an unprecedented event: zero transits. The global energy supply chain was brutally severed. By mid-March, transit volume had crashed by 97% compared to normal levels. Between March 1st and 13th, only 77 vessels made the crossing, compared to 1,229 during the same period historically, a drop exceeding 93%. Last week, a mere 40 ships successfully navigated the strait against a normal weekly average of 875. Consequently, shipping costs and risks have gone parabolic. International maritime insurers have drastically tightened policies, with war risk premiums skyrocketing by 5 to 10 times. Some insurers are outright refusing coverage for Persian Gulf routes entirely. Global shipping titans like Maersk and CMA-CGM have been forced to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 3,500 to 4,000 nautical miles to their journey and extending transit times by 10 to 14 days. These surging freight costs will inevitably be passed down to global consumers, radically accelerating inflationary pressures. Data from the International Energy Agency indicates that global oil supply has plummeted by 8 million barrels. Per Dalton Y this month, the largest supply disruption in history. While 32 member states released 400 million barrels of emergency reserves, the biggest intervention in the IEA's 52-year history, it is merely a drop in the bucket compared to the gaping supply deficit. Analysts at Macquarie Group warn that if the Middle East conflict drags into June, oil prices could breach $200 a barrel, placing a 40% probability on this nightmare scenario. Chronic energy shortages could trigger a severe global recession. This is exactly why Hormuz is the ultimate bargaining chip. Washington is desperate to secure control, to guarantee energy flows for itself and its allies, while Tehran intends to weaponize its geographical dominance to force the lifting of sanctions and secure its legitimate rights. Beyond the strait. Tehran has laid down a definitive 10-point plan, proposed by Iran's supreme leader and ratified by the Supreme National Security Council. This blueprint was delivered to Washington via Pakistan. Every single clause strikes at America's strategic vulnerabilities and delineates Tehran's absolute red lines. Historically, the U.S. has vehemently rejected these terms, making them the primary roadblock in the upcoming talks. According to a statement released early April 8 by the Supreme National Security Council, the core demands of this 10-point roadmap include, first, coordinating with Iranian armed forces to control transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Second, terminating the war against all members of the Axis of Resistance and ending Israeli aggression. Third, the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from all bases and deployments in the region. Fourth, establishing safe transit and shipping protocols in the Strait of Hormuz, ensuring Iran retains primary jurisdiction. Fifth, full financial compensation for Iran's losses subject to assessment. Sixth, the total lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, alongside the revocation of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. Seventh, the immediate unfreezing of all Iranian assets held overseas. Eighth, the official recognition and acceptance of Iran's uranium enrichment program. Ninth, terminating relevant resolutions from both the UN Security Council and the IAEA, a board of governors. 10th, A comprehensive cessation of hostilities across all fronts, including Lebanon. In addition to these core pillars, sources indicate that Tehran's terms allow for limited daily transit under Iranian supervision for a 2-week period. Contingent on a safe passage protocol. Iran pledges not to manufacture nuclear weapons and agrees to negotiate bilateral and multilateral peace treaties with regional actors, provided they align with its national interests. Furthermore, all parties must guarantee the sovereignty and safety of Iran's allies. According to U.S. intelligence leaks, the ceasefire terms also stipulate that Iran and Oman will levy transit fees on vessels navigating Hormuz. Tehran has been emphatic. Any agreement reached must become binding international law, securing a historic diplomatic triumph for the Iranian nation. However, if negotiations collapse, Iran is fully prepared for war, vowing to fight until its strategic gains are irrevocably consolidated. Ultimately, America's playbook of negotiating a ceasefire only to breach, it is not a new trick. It is standard hegemonic operating procedure. For decades, whenever an agreement contradicts Washington's interests, or whenever it serves their imperial ambitions, they will shred treaties and betray trust without a baseline of diplomatic decency. On one flank, the U.S. leverages temporary truces to deflect international outrage, avoid sinking into a regional quagmire, and buy critical time to recalibrate military assets. On the other flank, it covertly greenlights Israeli shadow strikes to bleed Iran's military and economic capabilities, dialing up the pressure to extract maximum concessions at the negotiating table, hoping to dominate the Middle East without firing a single shot. When you juxtapose this with Washington's heavily touted Core 5 or C5 concept, their true endgame becomes glaringly obvious. For those unfamiliar, the C5 strategy is essentially an American maneuver to bypass the UN Security Council's P5. By forging a US-led inner circle comprising the US, China, Russia, India, and Japan, deliberately boxing out European powers like the UK, France, and Germany. It is an attempt to supplant the G7 framework. According to US media, this C5 blueprint is a crucial pillar of America's comprehensive national security strategy. Washington envisions the C5 holding regular summits to dictate global affairs, with Middle Eastern security, specifically brokering Saudi-Israeli normalization. A desperate priority for Trump, sitting at the absolute top of the agenda. Looking ahead to the April 10th negotiations in Islamabad, we are guaranteed a grueling diplomatic battle. The chasm between the two sides is immense. America's chronic volatility colliding with Iran's unyielding red lines means this summit is shrouded in uncertainty. Can diplomacy forge a durable ceasefire, or is the region destined to plunge back into all-out war? Will the Strait of Hormuz reopen, or will it remain paralyzed, holding global energy security hostage? We will just have to wait and see. That wraps up this episode. I am Eleanor Hayes. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe as I continue to bring you a deeper, sharper perspective on our rapidly shifting global landscape. See you in the next one.